You're listening to WCAT Radio, your home for authentic Catholic programming.
Well, my name is Bryan Froehle, and I am delighted to be here together with Father Donald Kloster, and we are here carrying on a conversation about his recent completed research, very significant research indeed, on the traditional Latin Mass and how it is that those who are involved in the traditional Latin Mass, otherwise known as the Tridentine Rite, the Tridentine tradition, that is to say, that which traces itself to the Council of Trent, but really has a much longer trajectory over the history of the Church. How those who attend and worship in this way, and of course, without wanting to take too much time in saying, I can't resist but to point out, as has always been pointed out for those who love the Latin language, that the way one says attend is assist. And that word to assist at Mass, that very traditional word to assist at Mass, really became so critical over the many centuries of English speakers participating in the, what I'm going to call from here on out, unless Father Kloster decides otherwise, the TLM. And those who participate in the TLM would assist in the most deep and profound ways in their earnest prayer and their engagement, beginning to end. It is absolutely untrue that those who would participate and assist in TLM would not be fully engaged. Sometimes we might even describe that to be the case. But in fact, those who would insist in that Mass to this very day who participate in TLM will oftentimes share a very different faith experience, one that is much more profound and impactful in so many ways. And that is what we're here to discuss today. Because Father Kloster has just released a very significant study that gives us some data to work with regard to the impact of TLM attenders. So I'd like to open this up now to Father Kloster to ask that he might describe the vision behind this work and some of the findings as we begin to explore this conversation. Please, Father.
Very good. So anyone interested in seeing the study, you can go to liturgyguide.com. So one word, liturgyguide.com. The first study from 2018 is there. That was all adults that were studied over a 9-month period. In 2018, the study came out February 2019. And that study asked 7 questions. That study had 16 states and 1,773 samples. I was definitely hoping for more samples, but I was told as long as it's over 900 to 1,200, that it's a solid study, especially from that many states. This second study that was just released about 10 days ago, it was a follow-up study to study the 18 to 39-year-old demographic. Now that group is the future of the Church. And I knew that we wanted to get some good questions. The preliminary part, we actually did a pre-study, and that helped form the questions, I think, better than the first study. We were able to get not too many more samples, 1779, which is still an incredible amount of samples, but it was 39 states this time, a much broader sample. And we know that 2 years ago, there were 100,000 Catholics practicing on any given Sunday in the traditional Mass. Now that number is 150,000. It's gone up about 23 to 25% a year. It's incredible growth. And we know that the Novus Ordo is shrinking. So this is the Mass of the future. And this proves, to me anyway, that these kids are invested. No matter what else you want to say, they're invested. When you talk to these kids, they don't miss Mass, at least the ones that answer the survey. The ones that I've met individually in 4 different parishes that were Novus Ordo and Latin Mass, it was night and day. The kids always went to Mass. Their counterparts, if they went on vacation and went to the English-speaking Mass, the vernacular Mass, they weren't going to Mass when they went out of town. It wasn't going to happen. It's just a totally different commitment, a totally different theology. And I'll hand it over to you.
Well, Father, I really appreciate the way you're able to share the vision behind these two separate studies and the findings of the most recent study. There's only one item that I need to massively push back on. I need to really, really critique.
Right.
And this is because as someone who has reached an age where I am, if you will, together with you perhaps, among the new late young adults, I'd like to suggest that rather than considering these folks kids, we might consider them young adults or emerging adults. Okay. But that's my only pushback, Father, because when we look at 18 to 39-year-olds, we want to really see that, in fact, they're taking ownership as adults in the church.
Right.
And we all know that what we need to be doing today as church is to be forming adults in an adult faith so they can pass on that adult faith to the next generation. Right. And so I'd like to move the questions right now towards that sense of an adult faith. I'd like to ask you, not only as someone who directed these two very significant studies, but also to ask you, as someone who has been so involved naturally in church life and leadership now for the better part of a quarter of a century in so many ways, and also specifically as someone who is a priest of Christ's church, if you might share with us a little bit about what, in your view, it means to be adult in terms of faith.
Right. So we know that when we go to grammar school, say, we have to really adapt and assimilate information over our whole formation in the elementary school, intermediate school, and the secondary school, and leading up to college. All through there, we're growing in our knowledge. And I would say many baptized Catholics today, their faith is on a first or second grade level. It's not progressed into the adult maturation. And what I found with these young adults, or these emerging adults, as you like to say, they have definitely assimilated their faith. They're definitely on a college level, many of them, even people who didn't go to college, because they read, they study. And I would argue that just by watching the traditional Mass, you get a catechetical lesson. All the movements are done on purpose, and they were assimilated in the Mass organically. And I would argue that most of the Mass is, in this time of St. Peter, what we have today. Not everything, but most of it, because, and the reason I would say that is because of what happened in the temple. That in the temple, they would sacrifice the animals with two standing men on either side. And these standing men would help to assist the cutting up of the flesh and blood. The deacon and subdeacon are the two standing men. The candles we have burning, the 6 candles, very significant in the Jewish faith. The altar, the orientation, the sacrifices were performed in a specific area of the temple. And the animals were let in through the west door, the door of Satan, basically. These parallels cannot be ignored. But I digress, that these emerging adults are so invested that you see it in their eyes, you see it in their speech, you see it in the very way that it has permeated every aspect of their body.
I'd like to thank you for that insight, because, oftentimes we talk about an adult faith and what it means to come to an adult faith. Will oftentimes, and it's not wrong by any stretch, but we'll oftentimes talk more about propositions, that is to say, articles of faith. Very important, without a doubt. Mm-hmm. But the place where you've gone is arguably the deeper place still. Of course, we have to have the articles of faith. It's necessary, but not sufficient. Right. Because we may well be able to pass an exam, a test on some of those articles of faith. There may well be plenty of Catholics out there today who at one point in their lives could have passed such a test. But to what degree have we fully assimilated the depths of the symbols? And after all, we all know that beautiful and simple, very traditional definition of sacrament. That is to say, sign that affects what it signifies.
Right.
And that beautiful definition requires entering into a very rich symbolic universe where those symbols are more real than real, where they really represent the metaphysical reality of which we are all a part. What this requires ultimately is a sign, it would seem to me, and here I'd like to ask for your comment and critique of this observation. It requires an embodied response. It requires a kind of response that you were mentioning, one can see in the eyes, one can see in the motions of the person, one can see in one's level of engagement, in different movements of prayer and so forth. And I'd like to ask you, before we go deeper into the special findings of these very important studies, just what your response might be to that.
You know, it's interesting when in talking to this age group, we'll say, it's amazing. You can almost tell by talking to them how long they've gone to the Latin Mass. If they've just been going a year or 16 months, say, they'll get some of their vocabulary wrong. They'll have more of a gut feeling. And then once they've been there 3 to 5 years, they start reading, they start investigating, and they become veritable theologians who know their stuff. And I know as a priest, that's not possible with as little trainings that I've had. But it's the Mass. I'm convinced that Mass does something to you. As a priest, I've been saying it 22 years. And I remember in those first couple of years, I knew it was doing something to me, but I didn't think it was going to be where it is now. I thought it was just a good thing for me personally, spiritually. Now, I don't believe that. I believe that Mass needs to come back because of what it does to people.
You know, that brings to mind Prosper of Aquitaine's famous dictum, lex orandi, lex credendi. As I'm sure that you know, it was actually a little bit longer in the Latin, but let's keep it simple. Lex orandi, lex credendi. The law of prayer is a law of belief. The way we pray affects the way we believe, and it goes much deeper. In other words, than simply that articles of faith and proposition, as important as they are. And so I'm wondering if that's what you're talking about. That is to say that the way we pray and the way we do the liturgy has a profound impact in forming us for who and how we are. Is that what you're saying, Father?
Yes, and you know, when I did the first study, my expectation was to see numbers somewhere around pre-Vatican II numbers. What surprised me in the most profound way was how we superseded the Vatican II numbers. So all along, what we needed in the reform was what we're doing now, which is kind of, I think, very, very, very interesting. It's almost as if God is smiling at us. We did it totally backwards. And the Latin Mass, in coming through the back door, so we went from, some people say 75, some people say 80% participation. We went from that number to 98% with the kids, with the young adults, and 99% with everyone. So that's unheard of. We went from a birth rate before the council of 3.65 to now 3.6. Now, I believe that's a misnomer because these older women who were in the study contracepted at one point. My view is, since we have a 2.3 birth rate among all Catholics, that number is also artificial, and it's going to shrink because we know once the Hispanics or Spanish speakers come over after the first generation, their birth rate drops to 1.9. So they don't bring the birth rate up anymore. They're going to go down to about 2.0. The Latin Mass will head north to about 4.0, I would see in about 20 years. This is right now, for every 10 kids born in the Novus Ordo, 16 are born in the traditional Latin Mass. Of those 10 kids, we know that only one will practice as an adult. Of those 16 kids, about 15.8 are going to practice. Now, that is huge. That is a huge ratio. It's not going to take long. Demographics never lie.
Well, now we're coming to the kinds of things I must admit, Father, that has my excitement for a different hat that I wear. As you know, and as the listeners perhaps know, I happen to be not only a professor of practical theology and directing a PhD program in practical theology, but I happen as well to be in fact a PhD in sociology and to be a specialist in social science methods. Now, you're getting at right now in one of the most critical areas of good social science research in terms of inferential studies. And these are, of course, inferential studies where we're trying to infer causation. So the classic question is, as I'm sure you've already anticipated for what I'm about to say, between causation and correlation. In other words, it's conceivable that, in fact, people who are already oriented towards these much higher levels could have chosen but already be predisposed towards the findings you're yielding in your studies.
Right.
It could also be that simply when they come to participate, that they would otherwise have been going in a very different direction, but as a result of their participation in this, if you will, as a kind of a treatment for them to be involved in this, it produces a natural experiment. That is to say, that for those who are engaged in TLM, within a relatively short time, their numbers increase dramatically. In other words, they're caused by TLM experience because it's the only thing in common that could explain these shifts.
Right.
And that's where I would like to say that from what I can see, your work is a very significant step forward to being able to demonstrate causation rather than simple correlation. And I'm wondering if you can maybe expound a bit more on that from your perspective as the researcher in this case.
You know, with trying to be as honest as possible, I mean, I'm a nobody. I'm not a statistician. I'm not somebody who was an expert in these fields. And when I first started doing this, I had a lot of doors slammed in my face, a lot of people saying it couldn't be done. You're not qualified. You don't know what you're doing. You're going to make suppositions and that is kind of my personality, to make suppositions that I can't really prove. But then I started thinking, well, if you have an anecdote and it happens to you, but it doesn't just happen in one time in one state, it happens 5 times in 5 different states, that's a trend. I mean, that's a trend. And then too, in talking to these young adults and seeing their level of participation, the other thing that was phenomenal to me, right now, an average Catholic gives 1.2% of his income. A Protestant gives 2.5, double. Before the council, a Catholic gave about 2.5%. In the Depression, all Christians gave 3.3%. But right now, in the traditional Latin Mass population, they give 6%. 5 times what their Novus Ordo counterparts give. Now, what does that mean? Well, many people in my first survey put 0. They didn't give anything. It's an average. People keep saying, well, you have more wealthy people come to the Latin Mass. No, we don't. It is an average. And you have very wealthy people going to the Novus Ordo. But it's 1.2 because it's an average. So, again, when you look at what's happening, you look at the whole picture, only someone who is dead set against the growth of the Latin Mass would really not have their head turned by these studies. Because even if I'm off 10 points or 20 points, it still blows the Novus Ordo out of the water. And you probably know this doing all the research you've done. You're not going to be off 20 points. I mean, especially not a national survey. It's not going to happen. So these numbers are pretty solid. It's happened with 3,500 samples over 39 states, which is, about almost 2% of the population that go on Sundays. That is an incredibly large sample. And besides the fact that when you walk into these masses or that Vespers in Philadelphia, I was there personally. The whole Scola was 32 voices, and they were all under the age of 40, all of them. You looked around the congregation, and it was at least 75% in that age group. What were those people doing there at 7 o'clock in the evening on a Saturday night? Kids don't do that. I mean, younger people, young adults don't do that.
I really appreciate the passion that you're bringing to things. And now let's take a look, if we might, to the Church Universal. Let's consider, for example, to what degree you might suggest that the Congregation for Divine Worship, the Discipline of the Sacraments, in terms of the Holy See, or indeed even in terms of the Holy See, again, for the Congregation for the Defense of the Faith, what this data might suggest that could potentially be of interest within that particular level of church life.
Right. So I sent both studies here fairly recently to the Apostolic Nuncio, unsolicited, just so he could see them. Hopefully it'll get in his hands and not be thrown away by a secretary. But I think these bishops, what they don't understand, it's going to happen with or without them. And I think their resistance to this, to me, can only speak to one thing, and that is what the exorcists keep saying, that when they do their exorcisms, the demons hate Latin and they fear it. And these bishops could either be cooperating with that or they could just be useful allies. They have to understand that these young people are not going away. This explosive growth is not going away. And they have to be careful of not imitating Coca-Cola in 1985, when Coca-Cola spent hundreds of millions of dollars to roll out new Coke. Their research suggested only 13% of Coca-Cola drinkers, including myself, even liked it. I didn't like it. They, in 7 weeks, they didn't wait 7 months, 7 weeks, they pulled it all off the shelves, lost hundreds of millions of dollars, and went back to Coca-Cola Classic. We, as a church, our leadership has done the exact opposite. We keep with the same failed policies. We keep closing seminaries. We keep closing convents. Our sacraments are through the floor, and they don't seem willing to look at this possibility.
And so let's now take a look at the larger reality within the church, which is to say that we certainly see some real challenges in this country with regard to the next generation, with regard to, I think you were hinting at church leadership, or with regard to any one of a number of different dimensions. And I totally understand in this conversation that based on your research and what you've experienced, you would say that the answer in many ways is TLM.
Or at least, doctor, or at least let it alone and see what happens.
I hear you.
Stop putting roadblocks. Just let it go and see what happens.
And now I'd like to ask you, before we suggest the solution, which I think is already clear,
right?
I'd like to ask you what your diagnosis is of the major challenges besetting Catholic life today in these United States. If you're going to name, say, the top three main issues that you say, and you were restricted to just three, what would those be?
The first one would be the episcopacy, and the fact of the matter of these men largely are not chosen for their virtues. They're chosen from a good old boy network. If we could get more virtuous, maybe even go back to a monastic episcopacy. I don't know what the answer is, but that's the biggest thing, is our leadership. They're not in step with what's going on. They're bureaucrats. They're very money driven, and we have to get away from that. I would say the second thing would be, and this previous interviewer kept pushing catechesis. Catechesis, yes, but no, in the sense that we need people to get in the pews. And how does that happen? In my work in Ecuador, 7 years as a missionary, we did processions, we did adoration, we held talks in parks, we met people one-on-one. It's a very slow, arduous, painful process. I brought a church from 2% participation to, when I left, to 6% participation. Now, that doesn't sound like a lot, but that was a lot of work. And you get a lot of no's. You get a lot of people say, I'm not really interested. But we have to reach them somehow. And to my mind, it is the Mass. It is somehow getting them in the door to the Mass, answering their questions, befriending them. The social interaction is essential. I guess, and the third thing for me would be really concentrating on inculcating in parents the hierarchy of a vocation. First hierarchy is priest or religious. Second hierarchy is marriage, and the third is single. And if people realize that hierarchy, and I always tell people, if you discern out of the seminary and you're a man, give get married and give the church a priest, purely and simply, and make sure your kids are exposed to Latin Mass, because they start going to Latin Mass, we won't lose them. I mean, the statistics are proving it. Yes, we'll lose some. There'll be some black sheep as always, but we're at a very high level right now. That's because of the sung high masses, the solemn high masses, the low masses that are said more solemnly and slowly. The preaching has gotten better. All that has had a very good positive effect on the church.
Thanks very much for that. It sounds to me as if the diagnosis that you would have is not so much, if you will, on what is going on outside the church, but truly church leadership, as well as questions of local church leadership, by which I mean not only local in terms of diocese, but in terms of a particular parish, in terms of a particular group of Catholics, to be led by their priest, pastor, in a way that would lead to worship that is truly worshipful, if I'm hearing you correctly. And then the third element, beyond that middle element that's so critical of this evangelical reaching out to sharing the gospel, to sharing what it means to be church, to be relational, but also, of course, never forgetting that what holds us all together is the liturgy itself. The third element that I'm hearing from you is about the domestic church, so to speak. That is to say, the family, and how the family understands and passes on within the children who come from the very heart of that family this understanding of vocation and call, precisely in the order that you've described, in the order that would then cohere right back towards the leadership in terms of the faith community, the parish community, the church community, and then that larger church community, the local church, the diocesan church that you've just described before in terms of diocesan level leadership. Let me ask you, Father, am I understanding you correctly then that effectively you're looking at domestic church, and you're looking at parish church, and you're looking at diocesan church, leadership and formation? Is that correct?
Absolutely. It kind of overlaps in all three levels, and we have to get that right if we're going to have the type of success or the type of evangelization that we've always dreamed about.
And so your passion for TLM really comes because TLM can be seen as an expression of that which will give the most life from your own experience, certainly, and from the data that you have shared, to domestic church, overlapping, of course, with parish church, overlapping, of course, with local or diocesan church, overlapping all together with church.
Right.
Is that safe to say?
That's fair. And, something I always go back to is fruit. If you look at the Gospels, it's constantly talking about, ye shall know them by their fruits. Where is the fruit? And if it's not there, then we have to do something different to get there. Now, me as a priest, I just had my third spiritual son ordained a priest. All three of those guys are Latin Massers. I've had 5 spiritual daughters who are all traditional Latin Massers. Now, it could happen. I've had plenty of Novus Ordo altar boys. I've never had one go in the seminary and get ordained. Never. Never a girl. Why is that so? Is it just me? No, because I look around the country and we're starting to build traditional convents. We have built a traditional seminary. Parishes are popping up everywhere, and they're getting vocations at a 7 to 8 time clip, 7 or 8 to 1, relative to the number of Catholics in those two communities. So we see my own diocesan seminary in Bridgeport. When I was a seminarian in the 90s, we always had about 25 to 30 guys in the college. Now we have 3. I mean, it's like God has turned off the water spigot almost.
This raises a very important series of questions now for us to consider how, as church, we might truly flourish into the future. And once again, I think I'd like to put on my social science hat. And it would be great fun to just think about this now for how it is that one could have a robust study that could demonstrate causation. And I would just like to think out loud with you about that. And I would just be so interested in your comments and in your response as the researcher in these 2 very important studies. The first question I would have for you, and I'll have a few here that I'd like to just offer for your response. The first question I'd like to offer for you to respond is, given that there's something about the sheer ancient dimensions of TLM, the symbolic dimensions, I'm wondering if it would be important to place TLM in comparison with the study, say, of other perhaps equally ancient rites within the church that to this day are practiced and celebrated in a variety of ways. For example, the Maronite rite, or any one of a number of other equally ancient rites that have equally regular practice. And if there might be something there that would be helpful in understanding this question of causation, because I think it's going to be very important for us to move forward to be able to have strong data on causation. And your first studies certainly demonstrate some very, very interesting things with regard to this and the importance of further study. My second question would be, to what degree would it be helpful to do international comparative work? For example, we know that TLM is most definitely found in a variety of spaces, especially in Western Europe, for example. We certainly can find in German-speaking countries that there is a robust presence of TLM. We can find it as well in France. We certainly can find this as well in parts of the British Isles, and we could name other places around the world. I'm not going to name country by country, but you see what I'm suggesting. So I wonder if that might be helpful to consider by way of comparative work, or to allow there to be that kind of greater depth. In addition, third question, I'm wondering the degree to which it'd be helpful to be able to break down the data all the more at the level that one can truly compare someone and maybe even do longitudinal data, whereby one can compare the career, so to speak, of someone who is, let's say, involved in TLM for the first time at age 18 to 22, and then moves through TLM experience, let's say over a 7-year trajectory, to be able to better plot what that experience looks like and from the background that that person has. And then to look at someone randomly sampled, equally randomly sampled, obviously more than one single person, but a whole sample, who would be Catholic and not experiencing TLM. And I'm wondering if these kinds of designs are the kinds of things that you might be considering looking forward, perhaps including a design that might even take a look at not only lay people who experience this, but the ordained as well. And it may be also helpful to consider not only those who are ordained, but also those who enter consecrated life, as women religious, for example, who experience in certain communities regular celebration of TLM, and others in other communities who do not, and to be able to better understand how this works out. I'm just wondering what you might think of these things, again, because with my social science hat, I'm always thinking of studies to demonstrate causation. What might you say to this, Father?
No, I was always interested in that, but I was always being told not to go there because of the implications. And I think the implication for a lot of people is that if the Novus Ordo does start losing influence, they're going to see it as an indictment of their bad judgment, which I don't think that would necessarily infer bad judgment. I do know in my hospital work in 8 years, one of the biggest hospitals in San Antonio, I came across the 80-year-olds all the time. I left the church when the changes came. They couldn't really tell you why. They just didn't like it, and their spirit was disturbed. We cannot discount that because people say nobody wants to go back. Well, heck, you got rid of about 60% of the people who like the old Mass. Of course now you've got very few that wanted to come back, because you basically got the ones who are very obedient or the ones who wanted to see change in that way. They wanted to see an English Mass. Now, when you look at what's going on, the people who are coming, they're coming because they find the pearl of great price. We found, if you look deeper in these numbers, 84% came for a reason other than their parents. It wasn't that they were born and bred in it. They came for another reason. Now, to me, that isn't just the music. It isn't just the reverence. It is an inner pull that is doing something to them spiritually. So that's the first
that's the part that I'd like to come to now in this part of our conversation.
Okay.
Because when one examines causation itself can proceed from many different sources. We could think about this, if you will, in terms of what is sometimes described in social science analysis as a path analysis. Think of multiple paths that will lead in a... Now, without needing to discuss all the statistics behind it,
Right.
You could simply envision that there could be, let's say, one very strong causal arrow in light of the celebration and reality and experience of TLM itself.
Right.
It's equally conceivable that there could also be other kinds of feedback loops from one's engagement and commitment with others who are engaged and committed. It's also entirely imaginable that those three dimensions that you named could well turn out to be extraordinarily critical. And here I just want to suggest that leadership matters. It may well be that leadership matters, whether it is in terms of diocesan church, that is to say the leadership of the bishop, parish church, that is to say the leadership of the priest pastor, and finally, of course, the leadership in domestic church. One can describe this as the leadership of the father, the leadership of the parents, but certainly it's leadership. And I don't think that we need to necessarily be pointing in any one particular direction, but maybe in multiple directions to say that they intersect.
Right.
And the question is how to build up something that coheres. I'm wondering what you might respond to that in terms of these different dynamics that could be out there promising to build a future full of hope.
I think that kind of does touch on your second point with what would be the comparison between the Eastern liturgies and the Roman liturgy. And there is something about the Roman liturgy because it is of St. Peter. There is no coincidence in the fact that the Church of Peter became 98% of the Catholic Church. One of the obstacles I think the East has is a married episcopate. Because if you've got a man who can only devote, let's say, half his time to his apostolate and the other half to his family, he's already at a disadvantage. So that to me is one aspect. The Maronites are different. They're a horse of a different color because they've swallowed whole a lot of the Novus Ordo errors, in my opinion. So they have been influenced unduly by the Roman Rite in the Novus Ordo.
Forgive me, Father, then let's say, would you accept the Melkites as an example?
Melkites or even the Coptics, again, they have a lot of married priests, but their rite, I think, is more fruitful than the Novus Ordo, but I wouldn't say it's as fruitful as the Roman Rite in its glory and its splendor. That, to me, seems to be the pinnacle of the liturgy.
And at the same time, this would call out for causal demonstration, which may well be, for example, that we could take a look at different parts of the world where the Novus Ordo is celebrated in one way or another, but yet we see that there is this tremendous focus that can still be observed in terms of domestic church and in terms of parish leadership and diocesan leadership. What this could suggest, perhaps, is that those elements that you've described, that is to say, domestic church, parish leadership, diocesan leadership, are themselves connected in some way to what has made TLM so significant in all of this. And it seems to me that when we look at church universal, that is to say, not simply within these United States, but truly globally, all around the world, whether we're looking at the Philippines, or we're looking at Nigeria, or we're looking at any one of a number of countries in the world. I could name Brazil, I could name Mexico. Among those countries I've just named are some of the very largest Catholic countries in the world. Of course, there's Italy, a very large Catholic country by numbers of Catholics. But when you start to look at some of those numbers below the hood, one starts to raise questions perhaps. Yet one can see globally that you're raising a question that is ultimately closely related to TLM and can be related to it as well in terms of liturgical analysis. That is to say, the understanding of liturgy itself. Yet at the same time, you are in some very interesting ways raising profoundly ecclesial questions. Ecclesial questions, that is to say, of the domestic church itself, an ecclesia of some kind. And then we're looking at the ecclesia experience within parish, and ultimately the ecclesia within the local or particular church that is the diocese, and ultimately the church universal. Right. So what I would like to ask you now is, if you have given much work or thought, or if you would intend to a little bit further down the road perhaps, to questions not only of liturgical theology, but questions of ecclesiology. Because one of the takeaways I'm having actually from this conversation is not only the clarity with which you express the liturgical theology, but the depth of insight around the ecclesial sensibility that would seemingly, and this for me is a real delight to discover in this conversation, between your ecclesiology of the overlapping elements of domestic church, parish church, diocesan church, overall, of course, subsumed by church universal, overall part of, but yet unique expressions. And I would be very interested in asking you, to what degree could you envision future studies of TLM that could also engage core questions regarding your ecclesiological insights as well?
No, I think that would be very good to be incorporated with asking the priests their questions, perhaps some liturgical preferences, and then ecclesial insights, because I think you have touched on something that maybe could tie everything together. The fact of the matter is, I think there are many people who are scared of the Latin Mass in the sense that they don't understand what they don't want to understand. And that can become a huge obstacle. We have to convince people to understand that the church has always tried to evangelize. And if we're not getting results, then we need to do something differently. And all too often, we throw the same very specious arguments at problems that have never worked and will never work. We don't need another slideshow. We don't need another apostolate. What we do need is boots on the ground who love their fellow man, who want them to know the traditional faith. That's going to get people in the pews. And these bishops who aren't about that are spinning their wheels, and they're not helping anyone, least of all themselves.
You know, one thing that I'm hearing from you when you say the traditional faith is that what you have in mind is this rich symbolic universe by which you would understand, and by which all of us who have ever experienced TLM would certainly understand with regard to every moment, every word, every gesture, and to be able to take that into our daily lives as well as in our prayer lives at every level. Is that safe to say that when I hear you saying our traditional faith, that's what you have in mind?
Well, absolutely. So Dr. Froehle, coming from a Novus Ordo seminary, being ordained a Novus Ordo priest, and I've talked about this with other guys in my shoes, we feel cheated. There are things I still am discovering about the Mass and the church that I was never told. Why not? What would it have hurt for me to learn all these beautiful things? What would it have hurt for me to be a subdeacon, to be to be a porter, to be an exorcist? We didn't get those things, and yet they're so beautiful and so deep and so connected to not only our ancient Catholic faith, but the Jewish faith. Gregorian chant, the ties there. We have a heritage that's been hidden from us. And we cannot let people pull that away from us.
No, I hear that very, very clearly, and I think that's a very significant aspect, which is the pulling away. Let's face it, both of us trace our ancestry to Europe, where Latin was the language that held us together, and frankly, our ancestors in the faith together for untold centuries. Well, actually told centuries. We can tell the history of century upon century upon century that the generations before us experienced in that rich symbolic universe. By the same token, we certainly can recognize as well, as you note, that there's something special about that Latin language precisely because it carried the faith for, I'll simply say it, if you're comfortable with it, our ancestors, it's literal fact, for centuries and indeed millennia.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know quite how far it is that we might want to trace our own ancestors, literal ancestors, human ancestors in the faith, but something tells me that it would go back well beyond a millennium.
Absolutely.
And then we would be able to understand that all those generations experiencing in TLM. And we'd be able to reflect on that and what that means. It's somehow even written on our very selves. At the same time, I hear from you an embrace of what you might see, for example, in the Melkite or Coptic or other traditions that embrace this traditional richness of a symbolic universe. And so I certainly am hearing from you that it's as prized as Latin is, let's say, for us especially, who reflect that in our own ancestors going back more than a millennia and beyond. And of course, in terms of our own intellectual and spiritual forebears, all the way to the very beginning. I suppose we would say we understand, of course, that the New Testament was written in Greek. I understand that, but we certainly would understand the significance of all this.
Yes.
I guess what I want to ask you is, to what degree could you see parallels, not exactly the same, but parallels then for those from other backgrounds and aspects of other traditions within our one Catholic Church that might be, whether it's Melkite or Coptic, as you mentioned, or might today be in other parts of the world that while they might not trace their ancestors as we might, they themselves have a desire for that ecclesial sensibility that you describe that leads to a rich symbolic universe deeply embedded in that which is metaphysical reality, beyond that which we might taste, see, hear, smell, etc., but which is even more real than real. Because presumably, that's ultimately the entire purpose of TLM, or indeed of all of our prayer lives and faith lives, which is to engage in that metaphysical reality itself. I would be delighted to hear for your response and for you helping to clarify these things for myself, Father.
Well, the first thing that popped into my mind when you started on this vein was the common ancestry of all men, and the fact that even in the vesting prayers, we pray to our first parents.
Yes.
And that the first time I heard that, I was in the seminary, and I thought, first parents. And it absolutely is true. So while the Mozarabics, for example, have their liturgy based in St. James, you have some of the other liturgies based on St. Thomas. You have some others based on St. James the Less. So they all come into this one root, as it were, and manifest themselves as one religion for one mankind. And that is one of the most beautiful things, that we actually are brothers to each other, not just by the faith, but by our blood. Because if Adam and Eve are our parents, we're all related by blood. When we go into that Mass, that just super exceeds and super reinforces the blood of the Lamb making us one. And I can say without a doubt that I have a much deeper relationship with some of my parishioners than some of my blood family members. And that's because the blood of Christ supersedes the blood of Adam. I mean, without a doubt.
Without a doubt. And when we go into this theological reality that is truly a metaphysical reality, we go into holy ground, very holy ground, very, very special space. And what I'd like to ask you now in this is what you might hold out for the future, what you might see for the future that could be for these persons, these families, including those who are considering perhaps ordained ministry, and those who might be considering consecrated life. What this might mean in terms of the experience, not only of TLM, as significant as that is, and as that is obviously a part of the key part of your research, the core of your research, but how that connects in turn with what you mean by this rich symbolic universe, which is, after all, what the TLM expresses. And this rich ecclesial reality, this relational reality that I was hearing you express as well. And I'd like to hear you go a little bit more deeply about that and your hopes for the future.
Yes, I think what we're going to see is the Mass more and more expanding and like a concentric wave when you throw a rock in a river, and it's just going to keep expanding. And I would say the more and more a percentage that those Latin Masses become of the 71 or 72 million Catholics we have, the more and more it is going to give us concentric ripples into society in general. It's going to heal a lot of our divisions. It's going to heal a lot of our misconceptions. It's going to heal a lot of the relational errors within generations. When we see the Latin Mass specifically taking over more and being more and more a part of people's lives, we're not going to see a perfect world, but we're going to see a more perfect world than the one we're living in right now.
Which presumably would not be very difficult to be in a somewhat more perfect world than right now.
Absolutely.
And presumably the areas that you would anticipate that would almost change themselves would be those three ecclesial elements that were already mentioned. Is that right?
That's correct. And, I was thinking as you were talking about my anecdotal experience, but in my last parish, St. Mary's in Norwalk, I was there 2 years. And one of the things that struck me, and it came out in the study, was the amount of confessions I heard that were males. We had confession every day. Most days it was 30 minutes, and then a couple days a week we had an hour or 2 hours. But you could go into that 30 minutes of confession, and I could probably get 8 or 9 guys through the confessional. Confession should only be about 3 minutes anyway. And it struck me, I don't think I've ever been in a parish where that much of a percentage of males was coming to confessions. And in this study, 57% of the respondents of these 18 to 39-year-olds were male. Now that is huge. People may not think that's a great big deal, but it's 8 points higher than the national average. We only have a male population in this country of 49%. So when you've got 8% more than the national population coming to this Mass, it is hugely positive because we always said we want the males in Mass, and now we've got them.
Oh, I can certainly concur with that as a card-carrying sociologist, that data is extraordinarily interesting. And that suggests that so much of your work creates a case for much deeper scientific study of this question. Clearly, you have unearthed a number of very significant and very suggestive findings. The next steps that I would hope would be underway at some point would be ones that would carry on this work to an ever cleaner experimental design, an ever cleaner analytical design to be able to demonstrate some of these findings on, I would trust, an ongoing basis. Because it's never enough to simply affect an initial or a single conversation. And again, I'm speaking perhaps as a card-carrying social scientist based on this kind of reality, but also as someone who is just deeply in love with the church and who understands that change within church happens with ongoing conversation, ongoing engagement, and ultimately that is not of yourself or myself, but is of the Lord. And it doesn't happen because of what we do, but rather how we respond to what God does. And I'd like to lift that up as we move towards our conclusion now, as we're looking at concluding this wonderful hour conversation that we've been having. And I'd like to ask you, if you could ask any questions different next time around, or any additional questions, what would those questions be?
I think the big question would be, do you think you're in love with God? I mean, I think that could be the be all end all of what we're trying to do. Do you really think you're in love with God? And how do you think you're going to be able to give God to at least one more person, if not thousands more people?
Father, I'm so moved. All too often, as you well know, conversations on TLM can be reduced in one area or another. All too often, it can lead to people separating themselves out, and even, sadly, at various points, different sorts of battle lines drawn, which is a horror within an ecclesial reality. Yet the space that you've taken us to in this conversation, and which has made it so life-giving and for which I'm so deeply appreciative, is a space of love. Because ultimately, what is there but love, if truly God is love? And we know as well from John's gospel, rather than the first letter of John, that our Lord also reveals very self as the way, the truth, and the life. And as we encounter God, who is both truth and love itself, we need to ask ourselves this critical question, the critical question of love. To what degree are we every day committing and moving ourselves ever deeply in that love? And to what degree are we every day sharing and witnessing and bringing others through God's agency, not ours response to what God is doing in our lives, to that love, to live in that love, to share that love, and in so doing, to cooperate with God in the ongoing redemption of the world. So I ask you, Father, and I would like to extend to you the opportunity for the last word. I would not want to be the one to claim the last word. I had the privilege of the opening question, but I'd like to offer to you now, in our remaining minute or so, any final words you'd like to offer to those who are listening.
I think anytime I'm in a conversation with someone on a gut level, it always comes down to our salvation. And when we think about our salvation, if it's possible that we are to be saved, we have to be very Catholic in the belief that we were saved, we're being saved as long as we're practicing the faith, and we will be saved only in as much as we're cooperating with God in that last moment. With that in mind, we have to know that our mission is to open up that mystical world to as many people as possible. And in the Mass, there are two complete turns. I love to say this as often as I can. Two complete turns. The first complete turn is at the offertory. That's an invitation into eternity. The second complete turn is before the last blessing, when we're exiting eternity. And that's when we go out into the world and try to affect something on others that is otherworldly. Once we leave those doors of the church, that is our mission territory. And none of us is living as a hermit. Some people are hermits, but we that go to Mass are not hermits. Our mission is social and theological, period.
I have no words to respond other than my deepest heartfelt appreciation. Thank you very much, Father. Thank you for your work. thank you for your voice. And above all, thanks be to God.
Hello, God's beloved. I'm Annabelle Mosley, author, professor of theology, and host of Then Sings My Soul and Destination Sainthood on WCAT Radio. I invite you to listen in and find inspiration along this sacred journey we're traveling together to make our lives a masterpiece and, with God's grace, become saints. Join me, Annabelle Mosley, for Then Sings My Soul and Destination Sainthood on WCAT Radio. God bless you. Remember, you're never alone. God is always with you.
Thank you for listening to a production of WCAT Radio. Please join us in our mission of evangelization. And don't forget, love lifts up when knowledge takes flight.